Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion, inshallah, in which I'll be speaking to two Muslim poets. My name is Sadia Ahmed, and I'm a student from the Cambridge Muslim College, and I'm quite interested in Islam and literature and the essential overlap between them. I'm joined here by Lutfi Al-Nufoury, who is a junior doctor who lives and works in the northwest of England. He studied medicine at the University of Oxford and has recently travelled to Amman, Jordan, to study the Arabic language. The Invitations is his first collection of poems. Brother Lutfi, if you wouldn't mind holding your book up. And we also have Brother Paul Sutherland, who is a British-Canadian poet as well as the founding editor of Dreamcatcher. He has 15 published collections, mashallah, of poems, and is editing 7 others, so a prolific writer, mashallah. He's won literary awards, and one of his poems helped promote the Olympics in 2012. He's won grants and participated in many projects. His work also includes lectures on Sufi poets in particular and English literature, leading seminars, mentoring, and collaborating with musicians and visual artists. Brother Paul also runs creative workshops for all abilities. So thank you for joining us today, both of you. I think the first question that I'd like to ask both of you is, and we also have Brother Paul, inshallah, he'll be speaking about his new collection, his newest collection of poems?
New enough.
His new enough collection of poems, Servant of the Loving One, and it has a beautiful cover, mashallah. Brother Paul, this book of yours, this collection of poems, has been inspired by a particular significant figure in your life. If you wouldn't mind speaking to us about him.
It's very hard to put into words the impact of Sheikh Nazim Al-Haqqani, Allah bless his soul. I became a Muslim in 2004, and I met my wife in the same year before I became a Muslim, and we got married, and I became a Muslim. But before I met this man, he came into my heart. It's very hard to explain that, but he did. And he began to guide me so I made fewer stupid mistakes. Just simply as that. He helped me through my life, and sometimes as a poet that's a little bit difficult because you become oversensitive to certain issues. You feel hurt more often, maybe, and he guided me. He passed away in 2014. He's looking at me right now. This is the cover. This is a very rare photograph of him by Brother Kazim. And he was the leader of the Naqshbandi Tariqat, which is an order, a Sufi order, now being led by his son, Muhammad, Sheikh Muhammad Adil Rabbani. And when I met him, how can I say, he pinched my cheek like that when I met him. And people came up afterwards and said, there's people who have been coming here for 30 years and they haven't had their cheek pinched. So, he kind of indicated that he liked me, and I know he liked my wife Afifa, who he called his precious daughter, and he told me I wouldn't let you marry her unless I thought you were worth it. And it's kind of, a kind of mixture of challenges and affirmations that I think really benefit the human soul so that you grow. And he helped me very much on the route of poetry and maturing, even though I was already in my 50s. When I met him, he, how can I describe him to you? I mean, he just had this light. He had this beautiful expression. And when you were in his aura, you felt that. You felt a kind of peace. You felt that he had been into the darkness and come out into the light. And you trusted his guidance. You trusted his leading. I was always looking for a holy man from being a boy. My first spiritual experiences. I wanted to know about holiness. And I used to sit in the back of churches and watch. And eventually I found Sheikh Nazim through many different labyrinths. What can you say more about the man? It's wonderful that he is a human being.
Did you ever write poetry prior to meeting your Sheikh and prior to becoming Muslim?
Yes, much poetry.
Do you think it was a kind of natural inclination which you kind of discovered about yourself, or is it something that you actively realized that you wanted to train yourself to learn?
Well, it's both actually. It's both. My grandfather recited poetry to me when I was a toddler down in his workshop. He would recite 19th century narrative poems like, for example, Robert Browning's The Pied Piper of Hamelin. So you can imagine here I'm a boy of 5 years old playing in all his shavings because he was a cabinet maker. And at the same time he's reciting Robert Browning to me. So that was one thing. But there was also some urge in me to discover, because at the age of 9, I broke into his cupboard down in his workshop. I somehow jimmied it open and got inside and discovered pictures of the Second and First World War that I've never seen published. They were horrifying, they were terrifying. And Muhammad alayhi salatu says, search knowledge under China, and I had that kind of instinct, to search and try to find things. And so he forgave me that I broke into his cupboard, and I don't know how I managed to pry it open, but I did. And he had a little library, which was a small, narrow room with books going to the ceiling. And I remember looking at them, even before I could read. I was looking at the pictures of men like Gustave Doré, his illustrations of Paradise Lost, of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the Dante's Divine Comedy, these sort of books. And at the age of 17, I was playing football out on the street, Canadian football or American football, where you throw the ball back and forth. And I looked up at our window in the house where I was born. I thought, I should be up there writing poetry. And that's what I did. And I remember sitting under a tree in March, and the full moon was shining down, and I said, I want to be an epic poet. So something in me was pushing and pulling at the same time. Yeah.
It's lovely and wonderful how you've mentioned your grandfather and how essentially it seems like your love of poetry has been passed down from him.
Yes.
So your Sheikh has been significant on your journey, Islamic and poetic, and your grandfather, and I think that's quite significant because poetry essentially is beauty, and beauty by nature touches the heart. You mentioned the heart.
Yes.
And that's where we realize truth, essentially. So
I have to also say a lot from my father. My father, all four of them, my grandmother taught me high emotions, and my mother taught me practicalness and discipline. And my father was a wordsmith. I mean by that, he was always coming out with some kind of saying, Don't act like you were hatched in the sun on a fence post, And he used to invent words like, don't get any conniptions. Now, I can't quite know what conniptions means, but you see there's a cat in there, isn't there, somewhere? Conniptions. So this man was all the time throwing this language at me, and don't act like you were born in a barn, that sort of thing. It's all this Canadiana of the frontier age, because he was born in 1917, and in 1917 there was so much fish in Lake Ontario that you couldn't swim in the lake without bumping into them. There was so much fish. It was such a different world. he just carried all this stuff with him. And, he'd say, for example, if you're eating popcorn or something, no prize in the bottom. So it's just endless, this flow of language came flying at me all the time. So.
Language is quite significant to the kind of culture that's around us. So, for example, some of the things that your father may have said to you would be quite easy for you to understand because you're immersed in that kind of world, in that kind of culture. With that in mind, in terms of Islam and our inherited literary tradition, it's very, very interesting to consider the kind of literary context against which the Quran was revealed, for example, kind of Arab poetry, all the references and the specific metaphors used within it. And poetry cannot be detached, essentially, from our Islamic tradition. If you look, for example, at the Quran and this language about horses and about war and so on, this was significant to the kind of culture and the language of the Arabs of that time and place. I'm going to shift over to Brother Lutfi for a moment, inshallah. What inspired you to start writing this particular collection of poems? Do you think it was just a moment of inspiration that you kind of rolled with, or?
I have to thank Paul, actually, because I've been writing poetry for a while, but my career is as a doctor, and I studied medicine, and I don't know if any of you have any friends who are doctors or children who are going to medical school, but it's very much you're on the rails from the beginning, and you can feel like a horse blinkered, just sort of going to the next thing, A-levels, GCSEs, and I wanted to do medicine, and I love medicine, but I always felt a need to sort of to find something more. And I think poetry is a kind of observation of the world and a desire to document the observation. I think Paul would be able to second that from listening to, I remember listening to your lecture about when you're watching the rain on the leaves and all this kind of thing. And I mean, that brought to mind the verse of the Quran, وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. There's no leaf that falls without the knowledge of Allah. So this kind of thing of wanting to observe something all the time, that's where the desire to write came out of. But I certainly can't give you stories like Paul. I didn't sit under a tree with the moon shining on me and feel I wanted to become an epic poet. I was kind of like scribbling down notes on my iPhone between ward rounds, between patients and things like that. And sometimes I just have an image that I wanted to write down, and I knew that the words weren't enough to describe it, but I knew that if I just jotted it down, I would be able to preserve that and then later on work with it. So I've been doing that for years. But in the end I thought maybe I should get some of this published because I've written a lot and I knew it was very difficult, but I thought I'll have a look. And to be honest, when I surveyed the sort of modern poetry landscape, particularly I'm talking about very contemporary poets, I wouldn't say it was hostile, but I felt there was very much a style of writing and that my style might not fit into that style. So I looked around for people who I respected and thought, I would like to emulate, not necessarily in my style, but as a career as a poet. And that's a big thing. I can't really say that I'm going to emulate Paul, but the point is somebody who's true to themselves, has Islamic influences. And so I reached out to Paul, and he was the one who said the first thing you need to do is collect the poems together, and whether it's going to get published or not, you have to do that. Because I always thought, what's the point of doing it if I'm not going to get it published? But that was something that made me think, you have to make it yourself and work with it and forget what's going to happen to it afterwards. So that's what I did, and that's sort of how I got here.
I think also sometimes there can be quite some room for self-doubt when you're producing your own work and it's from your own kind of mental space and so on. Did you have particular family members or friends perhaps who encouraged you and who saw real potential, like publishing potential in your poetry?
Well, I don't think there's room for self-doubt. I think the whole thing comes from self-doubt. I mean, it's almost like poetry is generated from fragility, I would say. So a lot of people, as I said, Paul was someone who made me bring my poems together. I've always been kind of reluctant to share my poems with my family initially because I felt they were just going to be able to read so much into them because they know me so well. But my sister, who's here today, was very helpful, and she would proofread poems and sort of tell me whether and I think that really helped because she had that third link that she knew me. So she could sort of see what I was trying to do. And so, yeah, I think that really helped. And also, Sima, the editor of Beacon Books, was very supportive from minute one. And also, she was very... I'd never been involved in publishing before, and she was very supportive of the way I wanted to do things. And I didn't really feel that anyone was interfering with how I wanted to write. And I think anyone who's writing poetry, I don't know if you found this as well, Paul, but if someone's interfering from the beginning, it's already so fragile, you end up not being able to finish the thing. You know?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a long period of gestation that goes on sometimes, you know, editing and rewriting. I find that to be another joy of writing, is making a sad song and making it better, as the Beatles, you know, line goes. And really that is so essential, not to believe that what you put down on paper the first time is written in stone, that it can be evolved and changed, it can be turned into something stronger. And there's the joy and thrill of seeing something develop. And then you recognize that you didn't really know your own poem completely. There was also aspects of it that were hidden to you until you worked on it, and then it sort of came out, something that was there.
You know, God has made our capacities for language and for emotion quite vast, and in terms of the origins on our bodies of both, we tend to associate, you know, the language with kind of the mind and with the heart, and the same with kind of the awareness of God. And what's interesting is in our inherited Islamic tradition, we recognize the mind and the heart as being one. So as far as I understand, in the Quran, Allah uses aql and qalb interchangeably. So that's quite fascinating because, for example, Lutfi was speaking about being a doctor and having these, let's say mundane, I don't mean boring, but as in these practical things to do every day. And in our conversation earlier, Brother Paul, you were speaking about, you know, kind of the depth of emotion that we as humans feel, the sadness, the grief, and so on. And poetry can be an inherently liberating experience because you have to go through the kind of mundane, the dunya, and so on. And what we're essentially trying to do as humans and as Muslims is we're kind of looking up to the stars and we're looking up at beauty and we're looking to the Quran for beauty. So I was intrigued when Brother Lutfi mentioned that Quranic ayah about, you know, not a leaf falls, but that Allah knows it. That's just the English translation. But essentially, poetry can be described as a way of viewing the world. And as Muslims, based on the Quran and this beauty in the Quran, this is how we come to see things. Like, nothing has occurred on the face except that Allah has willed it. So when we kind of look at a flower, when we hear linguistic beauty and so on, we know that it's from God, and this is our the kind of way of looking at the world that we aspire to. I wanted to ask if you've kind of perhaps dabbled in writing your own, let's say, poems of a more secular nature prior to coming to Islam, and perhaps if you've noticed any kind of difference in...
Yes, it's a good question, really good question. And it's very hard to pin it down because I was also always aware of Western mystical traditions. And I wasn't entirely a secular poet by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I was always had this other side to my writing going back to 1972, you know, when I was first began the 7 Earth Odes. And that was one of the moments in the Bruce Peninsula between Lake Huron and Lake Georgian Bay, these huge bodies of water in the Great Lakes in the middle of Canada. And I was wandering, and I was staying in a guest house, and for 3 days I tried to find the grave of Nawi Bawi, which is the First Nation princess that I learned about. For 3 days I looked for her, because I just had this sort of desire, you know what I mean, to pursue something beyond the normal. Most people would have given up, but I just kept saying, well, it's got to be here somewhere. And I was walking down these long roads with grass on each side, and the roads were gravel, so there was dust spotted all the way along the high grass. And it was getting near it was in autumn, and it was getting near the point where it might start raining. And this, I watched this butterfly go across the road like this. I said, I'm going to follow that butterfly. And it led me to the grave of Nawi Babikwe in the middle of a field. So this was for me so important because it connected revelation to poetry, connected that there was a link between something very special and poetry. And I thought I could write about this. And I was dissatisfied with everything I'd written before. And when I told this story to my wife, she said it was a Sufi sheikh. They can appear as butterflies.
Essentially, what I'm hearing from that is linked to the idea that not a leaf falls except that Allah knows it, not a butterfly flaps its wings except that, the Lord of all beauty has sent it there. I also wanted to ask you both about your process for writing, because it sounds like it's at least somewhat spontaneous. It kind of occurs in the moment, you notice something and you go with it, or in your case, kind of in between work shifts and so on sometimes. Do you have perhaps a heavy filtering process, or do you, editing process thereafter, or do you kind of retain the spontaneous nature of your writing?
So I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, I do jot down the initial, and that's why I brought up the ayah, because, well, firstly, the whole power of the ayah is if not a leaf falls. If you're not the kind of person who cares about leaves falling or ever look at leaves falling, then the ayah is not going to be powerful to you. If you don't really think that a leaf falling and the beauty of that is important, then you don't understand the majesty of Allah's knowledge of the unseen world, which is what the ayah is talking about. So, I mean, obviously I'm reluctant to sort of compare that to, but this the observation side of it. The person who wants to look at things and observe them, that's the first thing needed. So when I write, that's what I do, finding something that I've observed. And I'm not actively looking, you just sort of knows things that are significant, and everyone feels this. I think this is my personal feeling. The difference in a poet is that you use language to then express it, and you have some skill in that. It doesn't mean that people who don't write poetry don't have that initial poetic sort of inspiration where they want to observe something. I think we all do that. That's a human thing. Poets just then go on and write it down, and then there is a tinkering process, getting back onto what you were saying. That's what I called it with Saima. I sometimes over-tinkered with my poems, kept changing them. She was extremely patient and sometimes the initial writing it down would be quick, but then it's a dangerous game of how much you're going to, and you can push it over the edge, and then you've ruined the whole thing. Well, that's what I found.
It's quite fascinating how you've mentioned that poetry is perhaps almost an inbuilt capacity into any human being, but you need to give yourself the chance essentially to observe things because the stimuli is there. And if we think about revelation, for example, Quranic revelation, which was through language, which was through the beauty of language, Muhammad ﷺ found himself retreating to an aspect of nature in the mountain, in the cave, and in stillness and in silence. That's sort of when revelation had reached him. Do you think being in a state of stillness is important, or do you think even when you're kind of really busy with life and your mind might feel a bit more chaotic and jumbled, poetry can even reach you then?
I think it can reach you in those times, but I think there's two things you're saying. Is stillness important in general? Massively important, yeah. I mean, particularly in this life now. And in my job, I'm getting emails every day and every night. I mean, it's on all of our jobs now. Trying to find some. The only time I've really found that kind of seclusion is in i'tikaf. If you turn your phone off and you stay in the masjid and you don't do anything else, you start to observe thoughts that have time to really to follow through to the end. Yeah. We don't give thoughts enough time to follow through to the end. And I think the way the Sunnah is, the Prophet ﷺ was in the centre of society always. And maybe that broke the previous idea of being a monk and going off on your own. And the holy people from previous traditions isolated themselves to the point they weren't really involved at all. The Prophet ﷺ was involved in the centre of society, in all the dealings of society, but he did take this time, like you say, almost to reset and to allow his thoughts, and of course we can't know what his thoughts would be, his level and his mansab, but we can kind of get a taste of the same thing if we allow our thoughts to to follow themselves through. This is why I'm saying that I think poetry is the writing, but everyone's got the ability, because otherwise the poet would have no role. Because then when you write the poem, no one's going to understand it. The reason people understand it is because they feel the same thing. They perhaps just did not know how to write it down.
Yeah.
That'd be my feeling.
If we kind of consider the human origins of language, Allah gave the profound ability to Adam alayhi salam, and I kind of imagine that when Allah taught Adam alayhi salam the names of all things, He wasn't just saying, you know, this is this and this is this and so on. I think there was that inherent beautiful quality to language at the start, because it's supposed to make you ultimately feel a sense of awe, like this is this, and it's profound and superb, and it can't have come from nothing. So I think we just need to give ourselves that chance, and it's not about monasticism necessarily. It's not about separating ourselves from the world in an unrealistic way, but finding that kind of time and space to reflect and consider things. And I think that's partly one of the benefits of Salah, because we have to carve out that kind of time and space for reflection and connecting with God. In terms of modernity and how people's minds might be now and their kind of relationship with beauty, it seems like people's thoughts can often be quite frenetic and disjointed, because you're kind of constantly bombarded with emails and text messages and all this kind of stuff. But I think the Muslim response is this response of like unity and cohesiveness, and everything is actually connected, and we find our calm in our relationship to oneness and to Allah, if that makes sense.
So I think that the Salah is a really good, I don't know if this is true or has a scriptural basis, but I heard it said that when we do the takbir at the start, this is almost like pushing the world behind us, pushing all the dunya behind us, so that we can then begin to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and focus in that way. So I think you're right, trying to break that cycle of the dunya is but then I think on the other hand, the dunya is what we're put here to deal with it. And I don't think we should think that our thoughts are impure because we've got all this distraction. That is our role here as well. That would be my take on it.
Wonderful. This has been a really illuminating and fascinating discussion, mashallah. In the kind of final minutes we have for this main part of the discussion, before we go on to accepting questions from the audience, inshallah, may I ask Brother Paul if you could summarize for the audience what this particular book of poetry of yours is all about?
Well, it's mostly to do with my relationship with my sheikh, Sheikh Nazim Al-Khani, Allah bless his soul, and the landscape of Cyprus. I'm very attached to nature. Maybe it's to do with Canada, but there's lots of Canada that's very built up. But I'm very, I feel strongly about the living environment, and that issue of a leaf doesn't fall, but Allah hears it. It's, to me, it's having to give yourself the time till you hear that leaf falling and it sounds like thunder. That's possible. You can do that, and it's possible for human beings to take that space, stillness, and just let it grow, let it go, repeating Allah, salawats, and go beyond rational thinking into some other space in which it's almost compelled upon you to try to write it down, because it's so important somehow. And that's what this book, I hope, aspires to. But at the same time, it's very influential, very influenced by the culture in Cyprus, the mixing of Christian and Islam, the Byzantines and their churches that you find the ruins of, and the divided land between the Turks and the Greeks. Why are they divided? When we're serving the same oneness. And so there's that tragedy that emerges as well, that we somehow manage to hang on to something so particular that it excludes other people. So and he gave me permission to write about him, which I mean I asked for that permission, and he went like this, checking with the higher authorities. And I said, okay.
SubhanAllah, coming back to the leaf imagery and its link to the Quran, what you were saying, Brother Paul, about hearing thunder from that leaf falling, it shows that poetry is a matter of how we choose to perceive things, because some might see it in a very kind of rationalistic and reductionist way, like, oh, this is just gravity acting on this, and the leaf is for this, and so on. But actually, if we kind of stand there and we really reflect on things, we can hear thunder, I think.
It took me, almost 12 hours of sitting under a tree before that happened.
And
You just sit there, and just wait. You get over your fear of snakes, and fear of being bitten by mosquitoes, and you just sit there and stay there and stay there. And then all this living environment becomes so personal and so beautiful to you that you can't imagine disturbing it. You don't want to disturb it. You just want to listen to the miracles going on around you all the time. I did that once on the moors. We had an argument in the house, and I walked out onto, not Saddleworth Moor, but one of the moors around Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, and I just sat there all night and watched the full moon go across the sky. And in the morning I found all these cobwebs hanging down from me, it was the midsummer and all these cobwebs. And at some point the moon, this physical thing, became the immaterial thing. And the space around it became the physical thing.
Beautiful, thank you very much. I hope, inshallah, this book will also act as a kind of sadaqa jariyah for your Sheikh.
Amen.
Inshallah. Brother Lutfi, if I could ask you the same question, if you could please summarize for the audience what you think your book is about and perhaps what the recurring themes might be.
It's always very difficult to follow this kind of I didn't sit under a tree for 12 hours. I wasn't able to stay on a moor for all night.
That doesn't mean it's the only way,
If that were the only way to write poems, it would be a tough ask.
Yeah.
But now this is my book. It's called The Invitations. It's probably, I would describe it as very personal in the sense that it's maybe an invitation into my life, experiences I've had, and I am half Syrian, half English. That comes into it as well, and how that's brought me to where I am. But it's not overly focused on identity and these kind of things, which I think we are overly focused on in the modern world. So there's a bit of everything there. It's short, you can just read 1 or 2 poems at a time. And there is definitely a role for nature, which we've talked a lot about today, but that is an essential part of all our lives. There are some poems about nature. Like we keep mentioning in the Quran is a book of nature. So anything that calls us back to nature is a good idea. But it's my first book, so it's the first foray, really. So, I hope, inshallah, there'll be more.
And
Inshallah.
In terms of both your respective collections of collections of poetry, do you think it's mainly kind of quote unquote negative experiences that generate the inspiration for these poems, like stress and uncertainty and so on, or do you think it's more positive experiences that you're seeking to capture?
I think the negative experiences make you sensitive, but I don't think the poems have to be depressing at all. I think it's kind of like, if we keep going with the nature metaphors, it's almost like disrupting soil or disrupting the ground. If you have disruption in your life, if you're upset, which we all are at times, and broken, then you are more receptive and you're more sensitive to the world, and then you're more able to express. But that expression does not have to be depressing. And this idea that artists always have to be depressing people who are sort of... This is why I never really got on with Larkin and Ted Hughes and these kind of people, because you read about their lives and they have pretty awful lives, weren't particularly nice people if you read about them, and all this kind of thing. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. That's just the way we learn, particularly from a Western Enlightenment tradition, that artists have to suffer. But I don't think from an Islamic tradition it has to be like that.
Yeah, necessarily. I quite like writing poetry. I'm not sure if Allah will ever call me to publish a book of my own, but from what I've found, sometimes it is just about capturing beauty and goodness and just relating to your creator through the written word. But also sometimes I've found that Quranic understanding, inna ma'al usri yusra, with hardship there is ease, there is beauty, there is relief and goodness. I think sometimes Allah gives you that ability and that inspiration to generate art and lovely words from your seemingly negative experience, and I find that quite profound, alhamdulillah. So perhaps that's why Van Gogh, for example, he produced his beautiful works from that space of sadness, but it doesn't always necessarily have to be the case. We now have roughly, let's say, 15 minutes, inshallah, for a Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has any sort of questions or reflections, please do feel free to raise your hand, and inshallah we'll take as many as we can. Anybody at all? Or we could just carry on speaking. Does nobody? Oh, we have a brother at the back with a question.
That was a very illuminating session. So I share a few things with Brother Lutfi as well, and probably I generationally sit between both of you in terms of faith. So I've been writing poetry for a long time as well. What's interesting is that I've always used it as a very cathartic sort of idea. I mean, I do write, I've not written hundreds of poems by any stretch of the imagination, but really the most honest poetry I've ever written has been as a result of some frustration or something that I'm sort of trying to deal with. And I find it difficult to deal with it, and actually writing it down is like I said, it's very cathartic, it's very helpful. But also there's something inside of me that I feel I just need to express somehow, but if I said it to another person, they wouldn't understand it, right? And writing it down actually is very helpful. But I share something about, I don't often share my poetry with many people. In fact, very few people at all. I remember I wrote a poem called Trapped, and my wife read it, and she said, "Do you think you're trapped in our marriage?" I said, "No, it's got nothing to do with our marriage at all." I said, "It's about something entirely different." And partly that's why I feel that sort of the poetry that I write is very personal to me, and sometimes I'm not sure if everybody will understand, exactly what I felt in that moment and what I was trying to convey. I have been asked to write poetry on 2 other occasions, very specifically outside of something that I was wanting to do myself, and I found that really difficult because there's something about connecting with what you're writing, and I really had to. One was actually about. When he goes to kill the Prophet after the Battle of Badr, and then the Prophet informs him that he knew that he was coming to kill him, he accepts Islam and so on. And I just had to keep imagining myself in this person's position, otherwise I felt that what I was writing wasn't particularly authentic, or it wouldn't convey the meaning of what I was trying to convey. So I suppose it's a reflection, but it's also a question in some ways that you've both spoken about observational poetry, which I find like, unless I maybe sat under a tree for 12 hours, maybe I would be able to connect with it at that level. But otherwise, I find observational poetry really very difficult. It's not because I don't appreciate what I'm seeing, it's do I understand it at that level where the leaf falling can become thunder? That's the fact that you said it actually blew my mind a little bit. I didn't even think about it like that. But yeah, I think observational poetry as opposed to sort of something that you feel. I wonder what your positions are on that and how much that plays into writing poetry. Sorry, it's a very long question.
No. I think when I talked about observational poetry, it doesn't mean you're purely observing. It's observing as a way to then process your feeling. So for example, if I feel like I miss my daughter, and I just write, "I miss my daughter," no one's going to want to buy that and read it and care about that. And also, it doesn't really do anything for me. If I start thinking about how I feel when I go to visit her, how the sun was on that particular day, how the wind felt, when the door closed and all this kind of thing, and I start writing those things down, then suddenly I move myself, not because I'm so clever, but just because I start to realize the profundity of my own feeling, my own emotion. So it's using observations to process your emotion, not just because I agree with you. If you just ask to observe random things, that's very difficult. That's the kind of thing poet laureates do, isn't it? They just sort of ask to write these things. And unfortunately, I feel often poet laureates' poems are very sterile because they're just forced to, observe something that they have no connection with. So I think you're right to be writing about yourself. When it's about observation, it's just about using what you observe from your life, whether that's internal or external, to express how you feel. That's what I meant. Really. I think that would be.
Well, I do get commissioned occasionally to write something. Just, will you write about this, please? I think gradually over the years, and I have lived a few years, it becomes a habit to write. And you just believe you can do it. So if someone asks me to write about, I don't know, recently something, it's like the poet Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, says, every spring is a commission. And I don't know I was up to it. I don't know if I was capable of responding, you know. Someone asked me to write a love poem, for example. I believe I can do it. Just because I have done it so many times that I feel if I put myself in a certain state that you mentioned, like here, a place, and prepare myself, I think I can do it. I really feel there is a role as a poet, when talking about a social role, to communicate things that other people perhaps can't communicate so easily. And sometimes I think that's really just a sort of a responsibility of a poet, you know. But I'm not saying that you can do that right away, but I mean, one of my great poetic heroes is Wilfred Owen, the First World War poet. And his sense that he just felt himself being asked to write the experiences of these soldiers, you know, that they couldn't express. And he was an officer. He didn't have to engage to this level, but he felt that sense of responsibility, you know, a sense of, how can I tell these men to go over that top and maybe get killed if I don't have the courage, you know, to go over the top with them, and if that doesn't come across in my poetry, that I'm with them, not that I'm out here somewhere, but that I'm with them. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but, you know, if someone asked me to write a poem, I would definitely try to do it.
I think what you were saying, Brother Paul, with regard to Wilfred Owen shows again how sensitivity, a receptivity, a willingness to observe things is important to writing poetry, because, you know, like being a doctor, like these two brothers, like being a soldier, essentially, you could take that approach of, I'm just here to do what I need to do, the very practical, hard-headed, I'm just going to do X, Y, and Z, or you could really hone in and focus on the emotional aspects of things, human nature, you know, reflection, and so on.
It's like Lutfi says, you know, like if I say I'm missing my daughter, but if you remember the journey, the sun, you think about Wilfred Owen and Strange Meeting, for example, or Spring Offensive, how he describes the flowers, how he describes the cave, how he describes the sounds of the guns and everything else. You realize the great artistry that's involved. So somewhere he had all these observations and all these feelings were coming in, but he found the time just to try to mold that and shape that into something that's now lived over 100 years. You know, it's the artistry is such an interesting thing, how you just work on something until it reaches a point of otherness, I would say. It almost leaves you. You almost become, did I write that? It almost starts to take on its own reality.
We have another brother here.
Yeah, you spoke about, it doesn't have to be about sadness. You don't sort of dig deep into the worst feelings that you've ever had. But isn't to be empathetic, I suppose, right? I mean, a person who's had a pretty standard, some might say boring, uneventful life, with no crisis and no incident. And how do those people then develop a sense of empathy? Because they've never been through anything, right? And so in order to do good poetry, I suppose, and to have that deeper sense of empathy, one might say that you have to go through crises. I mean, arguably, the Ihya al-Din of Imam Ghazali is a product of essentially a crisis that he went through. So I suppose what I'm asking is that are good poets people who have been through challenging times which have made them empathetic? And if people don't, does that mean that they won't be good poets?
I think maybe I didn't. I was trying to get across the point. I actually think disruption is important, like you're saying. I think crisis and disruption is important. I just don't think that the works that are produced have to reflect a negative aspect. And like Sister Sadia was saying about Van Gogh, yes, he was in an asylum and he was going through great mental anguish. But the paintings are very uplifting. They're energetic, uplifting. They're not depressing. As for the person who has a boring life, firstly, I think everyone has. I've never really met anyone who hasn't had some sort of severe pain or difficulty, even if superficially they appear boring. And being boring is very subjective as well. So I would always be careful to say, you know, such a person had an interesting life and such a person didn't, because we don't know what they were dealing with. But I think you're right. I think those things shape us and make us. And actually, more than poetry, the whole point of crisis is to actually bring us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what I believe anyway. That's disruption is supposed to remind us to turn back. Poetry is another, you know, obviously less important outcome. But of course, what you say is totally right. We're supposed to be hurt and disrupted in this life. And that's part of the purpose of the world, I think.
I think that's quite interesting what you were saying, because when you were speaking, I felt the limitation, I felt where empathy might end, you know, and how a poet like Shelley, the English romantic poet, is writing about Mont Blanc, you know, this mountain. Now, how does he manage to empathize with that mountain? You know, or the ocean, poets who've written about the ocean. And poets like Jalaluddin Rumi writing about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our empathy goes so far, but then somewhere imagination has to take over. Somewhere imagination that Ibn Arabi talks about in the join between the finite and the infinite, Balzac, has to happen. And that's very mysterious, how developing your feelings, stretching them out, suddenly turns into something other, something imaginative. Because you can't really identify with so many things in the world, can you? Empathize with them.
If we have brother here and then sister here, please.
I'll just say, the panel say that poetry is more grey than black and white as compared to prose. You can get away, you can say a lot and not say anything.
High nonsense, eh? Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, there is so much poetry out there, isn't there? I mean, where do we want to start and look at all the different kinds of poetry? And that is one of the values of writing. I mean, there is didactic poetry.
Yeah,
which are black and white.
Behind.
Yeah, black and white poetry where, you know, the poet is declaring, like Yevtushenko, the Russian poet, you know, saying, this is bad, this is right. Like Russian poets in the terms of the 20th century with Stalin and all this, these poets were speaking aggressively against a certain regime. So they could be black and white. And it was very dangerous to do so. Very dangerous to do so in certain circumstances. It still is in certain countries, isn't it?
But you're going to hide behind words.
Well, some of them failed to hide behind them. Even Shostakovich couldn't hide behind his music, and that, you know, music is much more grey. But it's risky to try to define anything, you know, because also. The difference between prose and poetry is another area of contention. What is the difference? Shelley's, for example, I mentioned before, said there is no difference. The difference is between measured language and unmeasured language. Interesting.
I think I would put what you're saying down to al-a'malu bin-niyat, works are according to intentions. In terms of obfuscating with your words, anyone can do that in prose or poetry. And yeah, and in fact, I often look into my own poems, and this is why I asked people like my sister and other people to comment, because I sort of ask, am I actually getting a point across here that I want to get across, or is this just a load of airy fairy whatever? So I think there are genuinely poets and prose writers who just whose desire is just to sort of sound interesting, without a real intention of trying to get a point across. But at the end of the day, if you have the right intention, even if you are the kind of person who writes in this very flowery way, that's fine, that's your style. And if you intend to put a point forward, if someone thinks you don't, then that's up to them, isn't it? I would say.
But it gives you an opportunity to say unpalatable things in a very palatable way.
Possibly. Although, to be honest, you can say what you want now, can't you?
Well, certain cultures, you definitely have to be careful what you say. But we had another question from...
Sorry.
Yes, my question is to Brother Paul. So in life, on this journey, we sort of have our inner struggles, and in Islam there's a big emphasis on working on your ego, and there's this growth journey that happens by working on the nafs and lower self. And I was just wondering if any of your poems, do you sort of write anything about that struggle, that growth that happens, that maturity that comes in life?
Well, I think I would say almost all my poetry is about that struggle, because there's a point where you have that immediate inspiration, which can be quite sudden and powerful. And then you start writing and you think, oh, that's wonderful, wonderful. And then you go back the next day and you think, well, how did I write that? And gradually, a friend of mine calls it's tainted. He says when you have that first expression, it's tainted. And then you have to work on it and try to make it better. And in that process to making it better, you really can't engage with the ego. The ego can't really get into that space very easily, because the ego doesn't like stuff that appears. It wants to say, we did that yesterday, we don't have to do it today. But if you keep going on with something like you're worshipping, how many times does the ego want to say to us, you worshipped yesterday, why are you worshipping today? How many times do you have to do this? But if you keep doing it over and over, then the ego really just can't get into that space. And it's something else that's motivating you and developing, so that the poem becomes less and less you, I, and becomes more and more that other people can relate to. That the I sort of slips away. And sometimes when I read poems in here, who is that I? Who is that I?
Beautiful, mashallah. Just to conclude then, inshallah, I wanted to see if we could get a show of hands perhaps, and please don't be shy. Does anyone here write their own poetry? So even if it's just very privately on your notes app on your phone, does anyone here write poetry? Okay, we've got some hands, mashallah. Be brave. This is something that Allah has given you the ability to do. Do we have anyone who didn't put their hands up just then, but is interested in writing poetry at some point? Okay, wonderful, mashallah. I think it's really important to remember that genuinely Allah has imbued all human beings with the ability to recognize beauty, to transfer that kind of beauty into the written word. Like, we've been given this phenomenal thing called language, and I think it's definitely learnable. And on a finishing note, I was told recently that a famous poet, Iqbal, who's heard of Iqbal here?
I have. Muhammad Iqbal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Apparently when he would write, he would have a mushaf on the table, and he'd also be in a state of wudu. So essentially he's directly tethering his writing, his work, to his creator, and I believe that Allah will give you inspiration with your writing. So on that note, thank you very much everybody for attending this. Please
Can I just say that we're going to have a poetry workshop tomorrow?
Oh, okay. Brother Paul just told me that we'll be having a poetry workshop tomorrow. What time?
Between 11:30. 11:30 to 1:30, I'll be leading a poetry workshop, and please come. It'll be open for everyone, and we won't be expecting you to be, an expert poet instantly.
Are you setting them some homework to write some poetry tonight and come back with it so you can check it tomorrow morning?
No. There's black and white. No.
I think brother here had a quick question.
Yeah, just wanted to be a bit cheeky and ask what you would read as your favourite poem, just to conclude the session.
Do we have time for that? I'm really sorry, I'm just being very practical here.
We're okay with that.
Okay, brilliant. So you could either flip to a random page or pick out your favourite one so far.
Oh, that's really a difficult question. I do value quite a few poets. I've been very attracted to the, the obvious ones like Rumi, Hafiz, and Said, and the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in different translations. But my favorite, I guess, is Derek Walcott, the Caribbean poet who wrote the epic Omarus, and the otherness, again, in that is remarkable. He passed away in 2017. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992. And he's just, he was an inspiration to me because he was so believed that his little island in the Caribbean could be the biggest place on earth. And so that's, again, a kind of modernity to me that I see in contemporary, is making that small thing, like the doctor, the medical imagery of going around the wards, your personal experience it, and transforming that into poetry. Taking that little bit of thing and make it huge so that other people can relate to it.
I'm really
So he's
sorry.
one of mine.
I think I misunderstood your request. Was that about the poet's favourite poets?
No, yeah, they want a reading from you.
Oh, Brother Paul,
I told him wrong, eh?
No, it's okay.
Please continue. Just share maybe reading.
Would you like to read?
Read a poem?
Yes, please.
Of your own choice.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't. My dyslexia means I can't hear sometimes as well. Okay, well, just imagine the poet. Imagine the poet. Yeah, Muhammad alayhi salam, we did thousands of poets as well. In that cave, where he was without the Quran, he was without wudu, he was without anything. He just went into that cave and he stayed there and was waiting and waiting and waiting. You prayed alone in a mountain hole through shrill night. No voice responded. I pray in darkness in my walled-in heart, among aging ambitions heaped junk. You knew unending illiteracy of being and struggled through doubts, delusions, before the angels spoke, before converts and fleeing for your life, the miraculous. You lowered your covered head into rock. Centuries had swirled and howled to sand. Your daughter time to time brought food, some Meccan dates with well water, I imagine. You bowed, not knowing light would come, submitted against fear's rush. What beasts might emerge? With lit eyes they perhaps watched, waiting to see if you would retreat. In an absent room, my prayer mat glows, a rectangle of sanity. On knees I shake, repeating salawat. Through my fingers a tasbih rattles. From inside faces gawk, hornless devils or angels. More than past your presence, is my shaking your doing? You prayed bookless, no script written, your knees imprinting glints, before the mission announced or you were entitled messenger, you felt emptiness, heard claims of lunacy, everyone's distracting alarm, but yet went on in worship before the angel at last spoke, read! I can't read. Your humble words back. When you slid down the screen and later told Waraka your vision, you looked in disbelief that you would need to arm yourself with God.
I think the only way to describe that is that it was completely beautiful, because it conveys Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and what he'd been going through and feeling. It's through your words, mashallah, just beautiful. And Brother Lutfi, if you wouldn't mind doing the same thing.
Difficult to follow as usual, isn't it?
It isn't. It isn't. You have your own style and it's beautiful. I admire it. So I'm pleased to hear it. I've never heard you read it, so I'm looking forward to hearing you read.
Inshallah. This poem is called Threadbare. It's about prayer and how we might think about how prayer punctuates our lives every single day as Muslims. Like cousins greet cousins, my feet greet the ground. Praying, I lift my hands to touch the world's edge. This is good, like that white light streaming through eyelids, asking you to kiss the morning back. And it's good, like a plum, whose cold flesh is so red and juicy, you'd better eat it standing over the sink. And this is calming, complete, like being tired out from long walks in lively green fells, gently slapped by knowing winds. Hardy sheep lifting their hooves over black rocks, hidden in grass. Then we turn back, standing late in the kitchen, warm light and supple feet, once sodden and flat, now arched in the dry glow, from heel to toe, souls aching with happiness. This is good, for there are no more gaps in the day anymore. The way my feet long to stand upon well-worn mats, to pray, like cousins greet cousins, their open hearts love as strong as it is threadbare.
Thank you very much, everyone. Can I just